All right, let's get started. Happy Monday and welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend. We're pretty close to the end of the quarter here. So as we approach the last couple of weeks, I want to use some time to give you a sense of what to expect and some of the ways to best prepare as we gear up for the very end of the term. So let's get started, talk about the things we need to do, and get into this week's focus on making listening accessible. All right, so I wanted to give you the kind of calendar for remaining classes at a glance. So today we'll be starting on this discussion of accessibility, making listening accessible to a wide range of people. We'll continue that thread on Tuesday. And then having talked to a few of you in terms of your progress in the course and overall, as well as my previous class, I know a lot of you have a lot going on. Many of you might not be here on Friday due to travel and other things. I know that you're feeling a crunch from a lot of assignments. So what I'll be doing for this Friday is I'll be here and I'll be able to give you the opportunity if you want to come to class to workshop or to develop your second essay. However, I won't require attendance for Friday's class, so you're welcome to work from home, do other things on Friday to help to catch up in your classes and be in the best position possible to complete that essay by the end of this week. Since that second essay is due by midnight on Sunday, you can use your get out of jail free card if you haven't used it already to turn that in a little bit later. And then I went ahead and pushed back the week 8 quiz since, because of coming in with the accident last week, I wanted to give you some additional time to finish and to work on that. So that'll be due on Sunday as well. Next week is our final full week of the class. Next week, we'll be getting into some of the limits and boundaries of listening. The final assignments that you'll be doing in the class after your second essay is just a short debrief writing assignment where, kind of like the beginning of the quarter, I'm asking you to have a conversation with somebody else in the class and then to kind of think about the ways that you better understand listening and can think about how listening was used in that conversation. So it's just a nice way to bookend things in the class, and you'll have the chance to do an activity in class next Monday for turning in and working on that final little assignment. And then we'll be using that next Wednesday and Friday to just wrap up the course to talk about some of the limits and drawbacks for listening. And then I'll also be posting an extra credit opportunity for you. If you've taken a class with me before, you know how this works. I give you an extra credit opportunity. If you do it, it adds 20 points or 2% on to your final grade. It's great for people that are on the bubble, like you have a 78 and you want to get a B minus. Or it can just be a buffer if you already have a good grade. You don't have to do it, but that prompt is an opportunity for you just to help out with your grade. And then what I'm asking you to do is to turn in any remaining assignments by the end of the day on the 19th of March. That way I can turn it in to EOU. They require me to submit final grades. So that's sort of the hard cutoff. I can't accept any sort of late assignments past that point. So just know that that's coming up. I've been working through your first essay so far. Things are looking pretty good. I'll be posting your official scores and having feedback for you on those later in the day. That will hopefully be helpful for you as you gear up for and complete your second essay assignment. So that's sort of the remaining 2 weeks at a glance. We do not have any sort of meeting time, either face-to-face or remote, for the final exam, simply because that's an opportunity for you to complete remaining work. And also, I know that the window between the winter and spring is really, really short. So I want you to have a bit of a time to refresh, do what you need to do to gear up for the spring. Also, just as another reminder, I highly encourage people, if you haven't done so already, to register for spring classes and to set up a meeting with your advisor in order to do so. Those fill up quickly, and the spring is a great opportunity for you to catch up on general education or major specific requirements if you haven't done so already. Questions on anything related to the schedule or how the next couple of weeks will look? If you have questions at any point, please let me know and I'm happy to help. So as a quick recap, last week we were getting at the peak reading and talking about space and place as impacting the listening process. So I want to hit up on a couple of the highlights before we get into new things for today. And then just as a reminder, with regard to the second essay due on Sunday, if you want to send me anything like a draft or an outline, or to set up a meeting with me, I'm happy to do so. The deadline, though, if you want to email me an optional draft or outline, is by this Friday so that I can turn that around to you. Remember that I'm in my office from noon to 12:45, from 2 to 3, also in the morning, from 10 to 10:45 by appointment. I have both the room upstairs in Ackerman and also a Zoom meeting that I idle in. So you're welcome to join through Zoom. Either way, if you want to talk about this assignment or need any additional help. And again, Friday, not taking attendance, but you're welcome to come in if you would like to work with me directly in preparing for this assignment. So last class, we went over some kind of context and information regarding Gibraltar. Remember, we went through a little video and talked about the idea that this sort of territory has this mix of culture and identity, that the sort of British ownership and also its proximity to Spain and sort of Spanish speaking creates this unique mixture of kind of competing perspectives and aspects of cultural identity. We also talked about some of the ways that this connected to space, place, and listening. The idea of constructing a soundscape, right, or a location in which sound is happening, like a city or street. The idea that identity, including cultural identity, can be formed in specific locations by invoking, right, the power of sound and of listening. And also the idea that listening, space, and place are really connected. So to sort of put a bow on the things we talked about last week, right? It's not just that space and place is physical location, and that when you're at a physical location, like you find that there's noise, there's disruption, it's loud, it's quiet. It's also the ways the specifics of that location impact the listening process. For instance, if there is, the native language and discussion, and suddenly there's this loud British parade and drums over that, right? Those competing sounds are so closely connected to culture and to listening that when we listen in specific locations, when we whisper in a library, right, we're invoking the history, the culture, the context of that space, and that informs how we listen and understand information. So all of those things are useful for you as one of your second essay topics. We also talked about some of the ways in which ethnography was conducted in the study, and the idea of techne or expertise in a particular task. So for this class, we are sort of asking the major question, what makes listening accessible? Dealing with the idea that accessibility, right, is about accommodating or supporting listening across a variety of identities and social locations. This allows us to think about listening in the context of disability and the ways in which those things connect more broadly to the listening process. So this is really relevant and important to this class for a lot of reasons. First of all, because listening, as we've talked about, is a sensory act, right? Listening might involve hearing, right? You're hearing somebody speak, you might be looking at them, but listening can also involve things like touch and the way that we use senses to make sense of information. So if disability impacts or implicates the way that we listen, for instance, somebody that is deaf, right, and uses things such as American Sign Language or lip reading, right, what listening means might look really different, and you might understand that differently. Or for folks that are hard of hearing, right, how can we consider listening in that way? So if listening is sort of this multi-part process, it involves our senses, what does it mean if our senses are impacted or implicated in who gets to listen and how we get to listen? So these are important considerations for listening more broadly. And a lot of my background, right, is in disability, rhetoric, communication, and all of that. And so I'm going to spend some time in this class because I think disability and disability history is pretty under-discussed and understood. To use this as an opportunity to get into these issues in a bit more detail and again, to help us provide some context regarding this week's reading. So this week's reading from Goggin comes from an instructor, University of Sydney, who sort of has a level of focus and engagement with Australian disability history, which has its own unique set of challenges and issues. And I'll also be sort of situating this in comparison with disability history in the United States. Comes from a media studies background and is really concerned with the ways in which media, digital spaces, and so on can be made accessible. One kind of interesting thing that's been happening, right, is over the past couple years, we've seen a lot of shifts in how media, communication, and so on happen. One thing that a lot of folks with disabilities and people from kind of diverse social and economic perspectives have been saying for years, right, is that allowing things such as remote options, working from home, and working from different locations has been something they've needed. However, right, oftentimes people were continuously told that's impossible, we can't do that, we couldn't support that. But with COVID, right, we've definitely seen the opportunity for more sort of online and remote work and opportunities to do so. And for many, right, those things might be here to stay, or things that can continue to be negotiated for accessibility. We've also seen some of the challenges and limits of accessibility, and knowing that, for instance, using Zoom has created challenges with things like nonverbal feedback, the ways in which access to things like stable internet and so on aren't always accessible, and other related concerns, such as the ways that COVID-19 has impacted folks with disabilities, right? Folks that are immunocompromised are significantly at higher risk. And so there's a lot of concerns that are brought up in that relationship too. So to again give you the TLDR or big thesis of this week's article and some of the major arguments that it makes, right? Listening is rarely, if ever, discussed in the context of accessibility. That is, we don't think about listening very much in general, as we've hit on numerous times in class, right? Businesses and companies don't really think about listening or what it means to be a good listener. We don't oftentimes think about good listening in interpersonal and face-to-face situations, right? Listening is too often treated as a given. Oh yeah, listening, it's just what we do. But especially, we don't oftentimes think about how to make things like listening accessible. One kind of exception or change regarding this has been the role of folks such as ASL interpreters, right? So if you have seen certain like Zoom meetings or presentations, sometimes you'll have like a separate box and a person on Zoom who takes on the role of an interpreter, or you might have things such as captions. So that's definitely been a really kind of important thing to include and situate on issues of accessibility, right? You can also have folks that are like typing and taking on that type of translator role. So for instance, right, my partner runs a disability rights nonprofit and has kind of invested in ESL and including ASL interpreters in every meeting. Knowing that for folks that are actively attending the meeting, they may not be deaf themselves. However, meetings are archived and saved, and as a result, folks that are deaf have been able to attend meetings and track previous meetings and understand what's going on. And so oftentimes, right, you can sort of pay it forward when you think about accessibility. Listening can be accessible through a variety of components. One of them, right, is the idea of considering what counts for listening. So we've talked a lot about how things such as nonverbal feedback can be a way that we can interpret and understand that somebody is listening, right? However, right, for a lot of folks, including folks that might be sort of under the neurodivergent umbrella, eye contact can be an exhausting and sensory challenging experience. And so somebody might not necessarily be using eye contact as a way of listening. So we might think, oh, they're not listening, but they are, and just aren't using eye contact as a way to do so. Listening, right, again, invokes the idea of senses. How are we using sight, sound, smell, all that stuff to understand messages? And who gets access to participation, right? To make listening or to create a listenable message, we need to think about some of the ways that a listenable message is accessible. For instance, one kind of interesting problem that has emerged is you might be familiar with Braille, right, which is used by folks who are blind, and involves using touch to indicate, like based on imprints, what a message is saying. So for instance, like you have a bathroom sign and under that it has Braille. One interesting problem is that the production of Braille actually comes from much of the production of like Braille used in signage comes from prison labor. And much of that prison labor and just the entire process of creating Braille actually leads to a lot of inaccuracies, where like wrong information, or just like language that is not correct is written in Braille. And so when folks who are blind use it, they're not actually given the information that they need. So a lot of challenges and issues to consider. I guess a way to start out in thinking about making listening accessible, and thinking about the sort of role that disability plays in terms of listening, is to define what disability is, right? And so when we hear the word disability, I think that there's a few things that might immediately come to mind, and also things that are kind of left out of the equation. So for instance, if you hear the word disability, you might think about the sort of the symbol of somebody in a wheelchair, right? It's used to designate parking space. You might think about somebody that is using a wheelchair or using crutches. You might think about it in very kind of visible and clear terms. But what we know, right, is that the context of disability is a lot more complicated. For instance, in the United States, it's estimated that about 20%, or about 1 in 5 folks have at least one disability. So that comes from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so that's a pretty wide swath, right? Some folks have identified that as the largest minority in the United States. I feel a little bit weird about that to describe it, but I do think that it's a very large chunk of the population. However, I think one really important component of this that I think makes disability somewhat unique from things such as race, gender, and so on, right, is, as disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson tells us, just about every one of us has some kind of relationship to disability in our life. For instance, maybe you're an athlete and you severely sprained your ankle, or you broke your arm, right, or have some type of injury, right, that has impacted your ability to participate. If you've had to wear a sling or have crutches, right, or just have this sort of ongoing or chronic pain, you've been impacted to some extent by disability. If you've gotten sick, including, if you caught a fever or flu, if you got COVID, right, and depending on the sort of impacts and degree to which you felt that, right, you've had that kind of relationship. So for some folks, right, disability is this sort of chronic and ongoing experience that people have for their entire lives, or disability is something that you're sort of in and out of at various phases. So it's definitely something we all encounter at some point, some longer than others. Another really key idea here is that oftentimes, again, when we think about disability, we're thinking about a wheelchair, we're thinking about crutches, but we're not necessarily thinking about things such as disability as it relates to differences in mental, cognitive, behavioral health, and many sort of invisible disabilities that impact things like autoimmune functions and our ability to engage in society. So for 96% of those with chronic medical conditions, their experiences might be invisible or intermittently visible, right? That somebody's disability isn't known unless they choose to share it, or in the rare moments where it's identified. To give you one example, I have kind of an outlier low blood pressure condition in which there are some situations where if I'm getting up or walking after standing, I don't get enough blood flow to the brain and I collapse, right? You wouldn't know normally that would be a thing, but when it happens, right, it's suddenly in the spotlight and it's suddenly noticeable. And so a lot of times that kind of experience of invisibility or intermittent visibility is an important factor. A couple other considerations. First of all, the way that we define disability and accessibility is pretty severely impacted by things such as gender and race, right? I do a lot of work related to communication as it relates to autism and autistic self-advocacy. We know that the sort of increased diagnoses is not necessarily due to the idea that it's an epidemic. Instead, that historically, the folks that were receiving diagnoses for related conditions were more likely to be white, more likely to be male, right? Because there were at times racial sort of biases and assumptions about the way that disability is experienced. Oh, only white people get this, or only boys get this, right? When in reality, we know that disability is felt very broadly across a variety of populations. Another idea here is that oftentimes we place disability into extremes, right? Either disability is infantilized, oh, you're like a little kid, right? We use things like charity narratives to be like, oh, look, you know, this child is receiving care and support, hooray, or is associated with being very old, right? You're somebody in assisted living who is struggling with some sort of mental health related issues such as Alzheimer's. And so oftentimes folks that are kind of in that middle space in the young to middle adulthood are left out of the picture. And then one other thing that I wanted to point to is the role of terminology, right? So we've kind of seen a shift in a lot of discussion with regard to the ways in which disability is defined and talked about. For instance, there are folks that especially sort of historically have been really big proponents of the idea of person-first language, right? Saying somebody is a person with disability under the idea that disability is this sort of outside element of who that person is, right? That they're person first. And we still hear that. People still choose to use that terminology to describe themselves in a lot of situations. However, we also see the importance of identity first terminology, right? People who say, I'm a disabled person, I'm a deaf person, I'm an autistic person, and so on, right? And folks might choose that terminology instead if they view sort of disability as a central or an important component of their identity, who they are and what's important to them, right? So for instance, right, if you were to say, you know, I am a Black person, right? You're situating and centralizing race as a component of yourself. Typically, somebody would not say, I am a person with Black, right? Because by saying that, you're assuming that that person is white and that Black is a sort of additive or other component outside of what a person means, with a person sort of being assumed to be white, right? In the same way, for folks who use identity first language, disability is central to who that person is, and you can't really separate those things out. There isn't a person that exists external to disability. All that to say, people use and sequence and identify themselves in very different ways. I think the best sort of framework is to respect the sequencing way that somebody chooses to identify themselves. So I might be using disabled person or person with disability somewhat interchangeably over the course of the year. Another really important component here that sort of ties to what we were just mentioning is the medical versus the social model. How many people have heard about these two models, the medical and social? Cool. New stuff. So if we think about sort of the past kind of several decades, right? We saw the rise of modern medicine, technology, health, and all of that, right? And what that gave rise to was what we considered to be the medical model of disability. The medical model assumes a few different things, right? It assumes that there is an ideal person or an ideal body, that there is a healthy, normal, functioning, so on type of body, right? And what the medical model assumes then is that if somebody experiences difference, whether it's sort of cognitive, whether it's something like somebody that was born without a limb, right? Or some other sort of issue, that is a problem, or that is a sort of subtractive element of that ideal body, right? In this idea, impairments and chronic illness are seen as the sort of main problems with that person. The disability is caused by impairment that happens at a very individual level. The individual is impaired, and as a result, is not how they should be. In the medical profession, their goal is to cure or to fix or to alleviate the problem. There are a lot of situations in which the medical model or approach can make a lot of sense, right? If, for instance, you have a really bad headache, you have migraines, or you have some type of chronic health condition like you're diabetic, right? You would take insulin. You would receive something that would help to counteract or deal with the problem. So there are a lot of situations in which a more medical approach is a good idea. The problem becomes when we purely focus on this as an individual issue, we ignore the ways in which society has created disabling conditions. For instance, there's a lot of different ways in which society might be inaccessible. For instance, the lack of a wheelchair ramp or a cutoff for a curb, right? Curb cutting is practice that has been done to allow folks to easily get on curbs. The lack of things like ASL or translation or interpretation for material, the lack of access for things like Braille for people that might be blind, right? Those things are not necessarily problems with the person as much as they are a problem with how we have constructed society and sort of created a world for people, right? That is that individuals experience barriers and the idea that there are inaccessibilities in things like building code, designs, services, education, access, that there are attitudes of discrimination, right? The idea folks with disabilities are less than or inferior or not wholly people, and that practices used to make the world more accessible are ones that can be more supportive, right? For instance, there's a lot of folks with disabilities who say, I live happy and fulfilling and meaningful lives. I would like to see the world as one that is more accessible or accommodating for me. To kind of highlight the differences between these two different models and the assumptions that come with them, I wanted to share a short video that helps us to differentiate those two just a little bit more.
According to the medical model of disability, the word disabled means less able. Less able to achieve your potential, less able to have meaningful relationships, less able to play an active part in the world around you, and that this is just your bad luck. This outdated view of the world puts the responsibility of overcoming disabling barriers on the person with an impairment. But this idea is changing. The more modern social model of disability says that a person doesn't have a disability, that they are disabled. They are disabled by society. It is the attitudes and physical barriers imposed on them by society that prevents them from achieving their potential. The social model was developed by disabled people and their allies to help them take action against discrimination and to empower people to find solutions, remove barriers, and campaign together for equality and human rights. They showed how people with lots of different impairments face many of the same problems. These disabling barriers include prejudiced opinions and attitudes, restricted access, and people being systematically excluded. The social model looks for the ways that society can be planned and organized in order to provide accessibility, independence, and opportunity in a way that enables people rather than disables them. What we learn from the social model of disability is that disability is a social construct created by social barriers, barriers which can be eliminated. We learn that it is the responsibility of government, public spaces, businesses, and individual people to make the changes, to increase the access, and build a more equal society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
right? So this highlights, I think, the key difference here between these two different models, right? And the idea here being that if our goal as people who are speaking, engaging, working professionally, and doing any other modes of engagement are designed to increase accessibility, then it involves us thinking about how we can make our own communication more accessible, more thoughtful, and sort of more responsive to the needs of populations across a variety of different elements of social difference. So that kind of helps us to highlight and contrast these two things a little bit. So what I want you to do is take a little bit of time on your own to brainstorm and think a little bit about this. In regards to, first of all, some of the barriers that might exist and impact accessibility. Again, one that we've talked about is like the lack of stairs, or the presence of stairs, the lack of something like an elevator or something similar that could be used. And I also want you to think a little bit about how some of these barriers could impact the ways in which people are able to listen. So I'll give you a little bit of time to brainstorm on that. So I'll give you another minute or two. All right. Go ahead and wrap up the current thought or idea that you're working on. And I'll ask you to hang on to this for now, and we'll continue to pick up on this and talk about this more in just a little bit. So this has kind of helped us think a little bit about the ways in which we create barriers to impact our ability to listen and to engage with one another. And thinking back from the very beginning to things like active listening, empathic listening, and so on, right? We have to be able to access listening in the first place for those types of listening to happen. What I want to do now is sort of, given the definitional things that we've explored related to defining disability and the two sort of major models of disability, I think the history and context of disability and accessibility in the United States is oftentimes very kind of misunderstood and under-discussed. So this kind of goes back to Brown versus Board of Education. The idea, right, that there was the prohibition of segregation on the basis, things such as race, which set the groundwork for segregation in areas such as disability. And I think that one thing that just is sort of not really understood or thought about is that up until, about 30 some years ago, there were a lot of situations in which folks with disabilities were institutionalized, were not included in things like the opportunity to participate in society, in jobs, or anything like that, and legal discrimination on that basis could happen, right? So, we had this sort of context in history in which folks with disabilities were oftentimes placed at the margins of society without a whole lot of opportunity for accessibility. If you're interested in examining some of the history or context surrounding disability, when I teach classes like intercultural, I'll share this film. I highly recommend watching the Netflix documentary Crip Camp. It goes into detail about Camp Jened and about the history that led up to passage of the ADA. It's a great piece. These are topics that are interesting for you to explore in more detail. Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act was sort of snuck in to the legislation, and it essentially created an opportunity to prevent disability discrimination in the workplace. But that section wasn't really implemented until there was this large-scale protest, the 504 protests, where people physically, occupied Capitol building and demanded that it be discrimination. Eventually, it did happen, and they were able to prevent that discrimination, but there were still a lot of barriers. So the big thing that happened in 1990, right, under George H.W., was the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we now know provides reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability, right? So if you're somebody that has ever needed to use an accommodation for a class, you know somebody that does, you use the Disability Services Office on campus, right? And they are able to provide instructors with guidelines on how to promote accessibility and provide people with accommodations. And that only exists because of the ADA. So obviously there are concerns surrounding things like pay, work access, discrimination that are still ongoing. But the ADA was sort of the biggest landmark in regards to disability rights in history that we have seen, at least in the United States. One example of sort of a key and foundational moment with issues of accessibility, listening, and history was the 1990 Capitol Crawl that happened leading up to the passage of the ADA. This was a major demonstration in which folks with disabilities, including many very physical disabilities that involve things like wheelchairs and crutches, crawled up the steps of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. The idea of physically going up the steps to show the disabling barriers and factors that were limiting full participation. I wanted to share a short clip that's an interview from the young woman pictured here, who was one of the people that did the Capitol Crawl.
It's our story. Jennifer Keelan, Denver, Colorado.
I remember when we were trying to get the ADA passed, and back in what was it, 1980? Or was it 1989 or 1990? And I decided that I wanted to climb the steps of the Washington Capitol, and everybody didn't want me to. It was supposed to be like an all-adult thing, and they're like, no, Jennifer, you're too young, you can't do it. And I turned to Wade Blank and I said, I need to climb the steps. I want to climb the steps. And Wade said, go for it. So I got out of my wheelchair and I started climbing. Well, the next thing I know, I've got 50 cameras on me and I've got mics all over me, and it's like the hottest day of the month of March, and I'm just dripping with sweat, and I'm saying to myself, not only am I going to do this for myself, but I'm going to do it for my friend Kenny, who died a couple of months earlier.
So Jennifer is an example, right, of the ways in which identifying issues of accessibility and doing this sort of public display or march was an opportunity to create awareness about issues of accessibility, right? How does one create a listenable environment if somebody cannot physically go to the environment which listening is happening? So again, kind of highlighting some of those issues of inaccessibility. So to kind of give you a connection here to this week's reading and some of the things that are being set up here, right? In terms of some of the major things that connect the disability history context, how we might think about this, to broader issues surrounding listening. It's the idea that people can benefit directly from listening to folks with disabilities in conversation. That we might assume that folks with disabilities aren't listening when they are, but it's a bit non-normative, and that there are new ways to listen. Not only are there things like lips reading, but also for folks that use American Sign Language, there are a lot of ways in which accents, rate of delivery, and so on happen in ASL in ways that we might not assume. This reading brings up Christopher Newell, who was a major activist in disability issues and also one of the folks that helped to sort of spearhead the social model that we talked about earlier. He's referenced a little bit in the content of this essay. And what I want you to do in some of the remaining few minutes that we have is just to take some time to pick up where you left off and to write just a bit more, to talk about and reflect on some of the ways you might make your listening more accessible, and some of the ways that people might listen in ways that we might not immediately associate with things or recognize as listening. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that, and then we'll wrap up. take just a couple more minutes. Go ahead and wrap up the current thought or idea that we're working on. I'll have some opportunities next class to share and talk a little bit about this in more detail, but I wanted to use today's class as a chance to get into discussing and addressing some of these topics. So to wrap up for today, these last 2 weeks, as we've talked about, are a chance for you to catch up on some of the remaining assignments and issues in the class. We talked about some history and context related to disability and disability history, including in the US, and also some of the ways to situate accessibility and to engage in the listening process in unique ways. For next class, we'll continue to look at the role of accessibility in listening and how to make our own listening a bit more accessible. So go ahead and either email or pass forward your attendance for today. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday.